Welcome everyone to our third panel of celebrations of Lida Yusupova's poetry. And this third panel focuses on Lida's discourse of feminism. Of course, all of the panels touch upon this theme to some extent. So this one will
Is there something wrong with the sound? No?
Sorry, what? Huh? Okay.
Does everybody hear some problems? There are some problems.
Not too well.
No, then it's mine. Sorry.
No worries. Okay. Hopefully there are no problems. Okay. So we're discussing Lida and feminism. If you've been following contemporary feminist poetry, there is hardly a writer in the Russophone feminist poetry scene who has not mentioned the importance of Lida Yusupova for their work. We will be concluding our panel today with a video address by Oksana Vasyakina talking exactly to this matter. But before that, we have a lovely panel of four participants. And so we're happy to have with us today Madeline Kinkel, who is one of the contributing translators to the Scholar We Know, the book we're celebrating today. Madeline holds a master's degree from the Harvard Divinity School, and her work focuses on the questions of women, gender, sexuality, and religion. We also are happy to have Olga Zilberbourg and Anna Halberstadt. They're both writers. Anna is a poet and also a psychoanalyst, and they were kind and generous enough to provide blurbs about Lida for the book. And last but not least, Scout Mills, who is a graduate student at Columbia University. And if I'm not mistaken, she plans to write about Lida in her dissertation. So welcome all. And Madeline, why don't we begin with you? Oh, and one more comment. To the audience, if you have questions at any moment, please feel free to type them into the chat and we'll make sure to address them at the end. Thank you so much. Madeline, the word's to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who organized this, and thank you for inviting me. So I know in the last panel, there was a discussion about the ethics of care in Yusupova's poetry, and this dovetails really well with what I will be talking about today. So I would like to focus specifically on the poem He Took a Wooden Stick in the English translation, which is one of the poems that I translated for the book, The Scar We Know. For those who might not have read it, the poem He Took a Wooden Stick is a gruesome piece from the verdict cycle. Using court documents, the poem recounts the story of a woman who is known only by her initial, G. This woman, G, was propositioned for sex by a man. She said no, and he began to attack her, kicking her head, strangling her until she fell unconscious, and then taking a wooden stick and violently penetrating her with it through her vagina. When he removed the stick, her entrails, intestines were visible on it. The woman survived the attack, but died 102 days later due to the injuries. Like all of the poems in the verdict cycle, we don't get the testimony or story from the victim herself. Though this woman, G, was able to testify to the court before she died, we only see this testimony secondhand, filtered through the court and in the context of the man's telling. This woman is dehumanized through the language of both the man and the court as they repeatedly insist that, quote, the vagina is not a vital organ, and that the death of the victim occurred only after 102 days. As I worked on the translations of these poems, I was thinking a lot about Judith Butler's work in Precarious Life. In that book, Judith Butler describes not just the political stakes of whose lives are grievable, but also how certain types of violence against vulnerable people are justified. Butler writes that if violence is done against those who are unreal, then from the perspective of violence, it fails to injure or negate those lives, since those lives are already negated. They cannot be mourned because they are always already lost, or rather never were. In the poem, He Took a Wooden Stick, we see the attempt to do just this, to insist that there was nothing there to begin with. One of the lines most often repeated in the poem is the court's statement that the vagina is not a vital organ. The vagina, the place on the body where this man penetrated and stabbed her, is declared not necessary for life. Though the woman's intestines were on the stick when he pulled it from her, the court repeats again and again that this part of the body is not important. This body, this person, is already being negated. It is not that the vagina stands in as a synecdoche for the victim, but rather this phrasing highlights how the court understands the victim as simultaneously defined by her genitals and disposable because of them. This poem's relentless repetition of the language of the court and this language of dehumanization wherein the victim is defined by her victimhood works as a paradox. The poem's insistence that we face again and again and again the negating language of the court in effect undoes it. Here we can see what Butler is describing, this need from the perspective of violence to negate the violence being done. And it is in this constant negation that the reader begins to suspect that this insistence that nothing was there, that the vagina is not a vital organ, that the death of this unnamed victim occurred only 102 days later, it is in this that the poem lays bare that there was something there to negate in the first place. One of the most striking places in the poem, when the text unravels, the poem sort of breaks down. This is on page 150 or 151 of the book. If you have it in front of you, this sort of breakdown begins. At first, the text begins to mirror the violence of the attack by repeating these two lines in a back and forth rhythm that first this man inserted the stick and then he withdrew it, and on it were the woman's intestines. And then we get the line that the death of the victim occurred only after 102 days. This line is then fragmented further, cut down to the phrase, the death of the victim. This fragment is repeated in even intervals for a page and a half until the poem disappears around it. There is this single phrase floating over a sea of white space on an otherwise empty page, the death of the victim. In English, this phrase is weighed down by these prepositions that are absent in the Russian, which is just these two words, smert poterpevshi. For 9 pages, these are the only words that appear on the page. It is in this repetition and in the silence that surrounds this phrase that the poem refuses to let the reader forget that there was a person, there was a woman, unknowable as she may be. Of every poem I worked on for the book, The Scar We Know, these were the most difficult pages to translate. I had the Russian open in one Word document and the English open in another, and I was scrolling through page after page, typing the same phrase over and over, trying to make sure I hadn't missed anything, that I had counted right how many times this phrase appeared. And it was in this that the reality of the words was inescapable. It was in this repetition that the violence and the unknowable life of G is made grievable, as the poem forced me as a translator and the English language reader to grapple with the reality behind the words. Despite the insistence that the vagina is not a vital organ and the death only occurred 102 days later, we as readers know that there is a person here to mourn. It becomes felt to English language readers who may be hundreds of miles away and years away from the incident of violence. Judith Butler writes that perhaps mourning has to do with agreeing to undergo a transformation. One finds oneself fallen. One is exhausted and does not know why. We are undone by each other, they write. And if we are not, we're missing something. Yusupova's poem, as hard as it is to read, makes a space for the reader to mourn this unknowable stranger as the poem itself is undone in the face of this loss. Thank you all so much.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Madeline. And then Olga, would you agree to go next? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me to participate. This is wonderful. This has been a wonderful event. So what I have to offer today is a close reading of one of Yusupova's poems, the Center for Gender Problems, Центр гендерных проблем. There are many ways to approach it, of course, and today I propose to read it as a poem that attempts to heal cultural traumas. It takes up the Soviet experience and the violence with which that culture treated the women's bodies. Ее тело, его еда, он охотник, а она еда. and restores agency to the female body, as well as reimagines the female body as a site for joy. I want to begin with a smile. The year is 1999. The speaker, Lida, returns to Petersburg from Canada, where she has discovered herself to be a lesbian, and she wants to meet fellow lesbians in Petersburg. Я очень хотела встретиться с лесбиянками и феминистками и позвонила в организацию под названием Центр гендерных проблем. The Center for Gender Problems, a new age organization decidedly post-Soviet, has a library, and she finds her way to the door of the apartment housing the makeshift library. A woman opens the door for her, and Lida smiles. For the purposes of this analysis, I will call the speaker Lida to distinguish her from the poet Yusupova. The woman who opens the door does not smile. Her face is expressionless. But as she takes Lida to the library, Lida's smile becomes beaming. Yet, as she meets other women in that apartment, none of them return her smile. The obvious way to read the smile I'm interpreting now is in the cross-cultural context. Here in the US, there's a widespread stereotype about Russians who don't smile. Lida has lived in Canada, has been Westernized, and so she's importing the Western smile back to Russia. My take on the smile, however, is that it's both that and also something slightly different. It's a smile of a supplicant, somebody who is placing herself in the position of a novice, perhaps even coming into a holy space looking for secret knowledge. She's dubious at her success from the start, but she's hoping to make a connection. A connection isn't immediately forthcoming. The lesbians and feminists are preoccupied with their own business and don't know how to relate to Lida, who looks heteronormative. To Lida, it is the women and the library that appear to be a somewhat hostile environment. The word library is repeated about a dozen times in this poem with deeply negative connotations. One of the asides from 2018, Ainsley had mentioned these asides in her presentation earlier today. These asides highlight the fact that this poem is a work of retrospection, has to do with the speaker dictating this poem into a phone, and the phone transcribes the word library, biblioteka, as a slut, bled. It's a very strong curse word. There's a lot to unpack here, but right now I want to focus on the fact that Yusupova seems to enjoy the irony of this technological malfunction and includes it into the poem because it highlights Lida's status as an outsider of the literary culture represented by this library. We have all heard about the particularities of Russian feminism as distinct from the Western feminism. The knowledge that Lida carries, she tells us that she has been reading about feminism in Toronto and that she's interested in writing for the Petersburg's library newsletter, is somehow completely alien to this world, and no possibility of communication exists between her and the representatives of this Petersburg feminist library. Это значило, что мне там делать нечего, и я вышла из этой комнаты и больше никогда в жизни туда не заходила. Simultaneously, the poem tells a separate narrative, a story within a story. Yusupova splices the library scene with that of a story told by Lida's ex-husband's mother, Leah. Leah survived the siege of Leningrad as a young girl. Her mother had warned Leah that cannibals are out there to catch and eat children, and once during the siege, when a man followed her, she realized that the man wanted to eat her. She also recalled seeing a piece of meat being sold on the street, very red meat, and she believed that this was human flesh. Lida reports Leah's feeling that her body was meat. Она почувствовала всем телом, что это тело, ее мясо. Note the use of color red here. Red becomes identified with human flesh, but then almost immediately this color becomes attached to the lip color of Lida's guide through the center, Vala. Vala is the only person in this whole center who gives Lida a time of day. Vala takes Lida past the library and the lesbian society room into the kitchen, makes tea for her, and soon in the poem we learn that Vala becomes Lida's lover. Red color later becomes the red of the blanket on which Vala lies naked. And in the final section of this poem, it becomes the color of Vala's clitoris, red as a pomegranate seed. Vala also finally shows Lida her smile. Vala smiles as she lies on the red blanket and with her legs spread open. I read the smile as a welcome to the club kind of smile, as a confirmation that Lida has successfully crossed the threshold of forbidden knowledge. The smile is Lida's reward for being so brave. what's interesting about the secret knowledge that Lida ultimately finds is that the path to it lay past the library. This knowledge is not of the intellectual and cultural kind. The path to this knowledge, cultural in the sense of high culture, the path to this knowledge also lay past the lesbian society, past the activism, so to speak. The knowledge that Lida acquires is the knowledge of sexuality and the body. What's even more interesting is that the transformation of Lida's relationship to the body itself that occurs in the poem, from the body that's marked as meat, as a prize for the cannibal. And I think it might be appropriate to read cannibalism here as both factual, as something that did happen during the siege of Leningrad, as well as mythologically and metaphorically. A young woman raised in the USSR was taught to see her body as at the disposal of the male desire. The body in this poem becomes a site of her own sexual desire and joy. It's also interesting to think of color red as accompanying this transformation. Red is obviously associated with the USSR's insignia, the red flag. I don't want to make too much of this connection, and yet I can't help but find cosmic irony in the way Yusupova is exercising through lesbian sex our Soviet experience from the body. It's also interesting to note that once Lida, the speaker of the poem, is finally exposed to lesbian sex, she begins to transform her past by fantasizing and composing a story about a pair of lesbians who loved each other during the siege of Leningrad. The lesbian experience allows the poet to rescue a true narrative of a deeply traumatic past and bring it into the present with her. It allows her to take what she knows is true and to couple it with the fiction of a nurturing love story. There's obviously a lot more to say about this poem, but I will end my remarks here, and I will only add that considering the English language book as a whole, I find it very moving that this poem closes the collection. It uses many of the techniques and tropes Yusupova developed elsewhere in her work, and yet it also feels like it moves her work to new ground, provides opening towards a transformative and imaginative way of considering the Soviet past, as well as helps to reformulate the attitudes towards the female body, helping us to stop treating ourselves as meat.
Olga, thank you so much. And now let's turn to Anna Halberstadt, who will give her talk. Thank you so much, Anna and Olga. Anna, I believe you're muted.
Now, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm a psychologist and a social worker, and actually my specialty is in family, couples, and sexual therapy. So it doesn't matter. But because I worked for so many years with immigrants from the Soviet Union, I could observe those changes that happened to women over those years in my office, I would say. Lydia Yusupova's poetry, to me, is important in many different ways. It's written, Ainsley Morse wrote that it's written like American poetry. It's very free verse. It's very far from traditional Russian poetry, written in iambic pentameter or any other, formal poetry. And those texts speak to women, and not only to women, in a different way. And I think that poetry that is dedicated, say, to a lesbian woman coming out, obviously Adrienne Rich, Eileen Miles, whose book Selected, I translated, she talks about this, profusely in Inferno. What's important to me in her poems is something else. This is not just Soviet upbringing that women had in the Soviet Union. I think this kind of, if you want, female tragedy continues, because nowadays the statistic of violent death, somebody dies a violent death in Russia, 2/3 of these victims are women that were killed by their partner. It really tells you something. Also, one thing that happened after perestroika, Yelena Fonailova, we just had a discussion in Fem Festival. She said that in the Soviet Union, women had formal rights. For example, Soviet women voted in 1917, right? French women started to vote in 1949. So there were women, doctors and engineers, but when they came home, the picture was different. Larisa Lysutkina, a Russian feminist writer of the 90s, describes, she talks about the statistics. An average woman in the Soviet Union after work spent 40 hours a week taking care of domestic stuff, shopping, cooking, taking care of her kids, planning, and so on and so forth. An average male spent 4 hours a week doing the same. So a man's identity was mostly based on his professional occupation. A woman had many other roles. She was a daughter, she was a mother, she was a sister, she took care of all these. So the equality was formal, yet in the Slavic conference in, I think, late 1990s, a woman, a professor in St. Petersburg University who was teaching women's issues, said, I feel sorry for my daughter's generation because even in the Soviet time, women, she said, had more self-awareness of more rights. What she was talking about is that new capitalism brought this new possibility, a new idea. If you are young and you're pretty, this is something you can sell. It's an asset, and if you're not stupid, you have to sell it well. So some of the old Soviet values, have gone down the drain. These girls, I've seen documentaries, were saying, well, my father was an engineer and my mother was a doctor. So they didn't make any money. What kind of life is that? So say becoming an escort is much more glamorous. In focus groups, 15 and 16-year-old girls said they wanted to become a putana, a hotel prostitute, an escort. So this also affected this objectification that women actually kind of accepted, So going back to Lida Yusupova's poems, I want to talk about two poems. One is called Minutka, 1 minute, and another is Mateyuk. What strikes me in Minutka is this young woman who is asked in 1983 to sleep with a guy whose name is Koka. Rita asked me to sleep with Koka. He still hadn't even tried sex. It was a white night in 1983. He was getting shipped off to the army in 2 days. So she describes in painful detail how this young woman, for no good reason, is trying to have sex with a guy she doesn't like. She's not attracted to him. It's painful. In the end, she's performing oral sex. He is drunk. And then he gets killed in Afghanistan, a couple of months later. So it's passivity and dependence and kind of lack of self-awareness or self-worth that was very typical for young women there. This guy likes you, you have to go out with him even if you don't like him. A friend asks you to sleep with this guy you're not attracted to, you don't even question that. You kind of automatically go to the slaughter, And Mateyuk describes a different situation. It's, I think, autobiographical. But again, this is a girl who trusts a guy who is a friend of an acquaintance. She barely even knows him, who eventually, takes her into some apartment where he has something, whatever, some kind of business or whatever, and he rapes her. And all she has to say that this is not right, this is not right, this is not right, this is not right. Something happened recently that totally made me again think about this poem. I had a patient who came from one of the republics, I'm not going to disclose any details, who basically told me that she's in a relationship and something in this relationship provoked a PTSD reaction, that when she was 18, she was a student in Moscow. There was a young boy who was a friend of hers who took her to an apartment. He was Chechen, where an older man in his 40s beat her up, broke her nose, raped her. She was a virgin, an 18-year-old virgin. And she now has scars on her body. That was 15 years ago. And somebody warned her that she should not complain to the police because things would get even worse. So you are thinking that this Matyayuk, I mean, this is kind of a stereotypical, it's like an archetype of women's behavior, you know, in the country where it continues being reinforced, you know. And feminist poetry and feminist movement, there are many men, even in Russian poetry, that want to see it as kind of a marginal thing. That, okay, these women, feminists, they can't even write well, their texts are not poetic, they have nothing to do with, you know, like real poetry that is written masterfully, and so on and so forth. There is a need to marginalize it, or to feel, or to put it down as something secondary and unimportant. I actually think that Lida Yusupov's poetry is quite important, because I think it's broader than just gender issues, lesbian coming out. I think it actually talks to the psyche of women that come from this culture, even now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's so nice to see the talks interconnecting, and that both you and Olga spoke about the historical dimensions of Lida's experience. Okay, and now I will give the word to Scout Mills. Scout, whenever you're ready.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to all the organizers and panelists, and for including me in this. I'm planning to talk primarily about trauma and violence in the poetic cycle verdicts, so a little repetition for us, and hopefully it will inspire a good discussion. It is often difficult to imagine how exactly to conceptualize traumatic events and write about them successfully. The very nature of trauma suggests that it is a wound that cannot be truly known and conceptualized, and therefore manifests itself in repetition. Lida Yusupova's poetry, particularly in the cycle of verdicts, is one example of how to deconstruct and reconstruct trauma using existing documents, removing personal experience and allowing readers to reflect on often horrific, incredibly traumatic crimes as witnesses not to the events themselves, but to the court's reaction to them. From the decriminalization of domestic violence in Russia to homophobic violence, Yusupova takes bureaucratic language and fuses it with the language of affect, rendering the traumatic event into poetry by discovering a space between official discourse and emotion. I propose to examine Yusupova's poetry as it weaves documentary with affect. A mixture of bureaucratic and objective description merges with a subjective affect to create an atmosphere wherein the author is outside of the events as a witness, reevaluating the courtroom narrative to mimic a traumatic event, allowing objective description to fall apart into verse. Repetition and fragmentation are essential parts of Yusupova's poetry, and these two elements combined work together to highlight important aspects of the text wherein the reader is both witness and victim. Yusupova simultaneously alienates the reader and calls the reader in to experience the events she describes firsthand. I intend to argue that by using poetry as a medium, Yusupova deconstructs traumatic events by creating a dichotomy between official discourse and affect, which she in turn breaks down and complicates. The construction and deconstruction of this binary opposition lies in the transformation between affected speech and official speech, both of which become poetry when they are dissolved and remade as a whole. If trauma is truly unspeakable, then how can an author attempt to write about it? I would argue that trauma is only unspeakable in the sense that it must be transformed. Why write about what cannot be said? Though I do not disagree that trauma is near impossible to render into text, if an author presents the text as fragments from the event, and in Yusupova's case, fragments from the observation of the event, the trauma itself is not described or even spoken about. These fragments are not actual depictions of trauma, but depictions of a perspective that undermines the trauma and insists there's nothing traumatic about it. It is what Yusupova does not say that contains the true nature of trauma, the gaps, the fragments, the repetitions, the observations. It is necessary to attempt to write about something such as trauma, as this particular concept is one that defies narrative and thus must be a point for experimentation. Trauma can be art without narrative and extends far beyond the traumatic event itself, transforms the self, rendering the self both victim and survivor, or, most fittingly, something in between and beyond these terms. Experiencing trauma is more than the event. Experiencing trauma is the constant repetition of the past transformed into the present, wherein maladaptive behaviors appear to cope with the way in which trauma invades the psyche in every experience, including those that do not seem to fall into the definition of a trigger or a flashback. Poetry, too, takes the traumatic event and fuses it with different, seemingly unrelated situations. In Yusupova's poetry, trauma is in the chaos of misunderstanding. That is, Yusupova takes the bones of the traumatic event as described by the law and the courts and makes these heartless documents chaotic by rearranging them and adding notes and emotions until we as readers are forced to conceptualize trauma as something lacking in the eyes of the law. There is something traumatic in every line of Yusupova's poetry, and we as witnesses are forced to fill in the blanks and let the documents speak for themselves. Poetry from verdicts works to deconstruct bureaucratic speech through the use of frequent repetition and fragments. By repeating certain words, Yusupova highlights the important aspects of the crime that relate to affect. The law falls apart and becomes personal. The climax of one such poem regarding the decriminalization of domestic violence in Russia occurs with its repetitions of the word boy or pain, which highlights the human element of something as cold and indifferent as the law. The poem is reduced to pain itself. By rendering the law in verse, the poetic effect is humanization. Poetry is often concerned with affect, and this poem is no exception. The poem, He Took a Wooden Stick, has violent content that is overwhelming and horrific, but there are no lofty metaphors that make it so. It presents reality in some kind of pure form. However, this reality is the reality told by the law, which is not the reality of trauma. By leaving these lines alone, the reader is forced to fill them with meaning, and the careful selection of lines from documents and their placement in the text inject them with meaning. The repetition of the vagina is not a vital organ and the death of the victim make it impossible to look away from the text. Even if you glance over it, you cannot ignore it. By simply repeating these lines and placing them amid other parts of court documents, they become human, as if the lines echo through the reader's head. In this poem in particular, the clear implication of the vagina not being a vital organ is not nearly as important as its actual repetition in the text. However, this conflict between the idea of an organ being vital in the eyes of the law and from the perspective of someone who has experienced such violence is still of great importance. The fragmented text mimics a traumatic event in these ways. Tara Roeder's approach to writing about sexual violence is relevant to Yusupova, as it too addresses the issue of the courtroom narrative and the requirement that victims of sexual violence must tell a cohesive narrative in order to be believed. Roeder addresses memoirs of rape victims as they, quote, function as a different and necessary type of public testimony, end quote. The idea of trauma as something far from linear is commonly accepted, and we can use Roeder's assessment of memoirs to analyze not only Yusupova, but other contemporary Russian poets who address themes of violence, especially sexual violence. Yusupova all but removes emotion from her accounts of courtroom narratives, but somehow manages to inject this emotion into the text through fragments and repetition. Her approach to writing about traumatic events dissects the courtroom narrative itself, but rather than liberating the event from the narrative, she underlines just how bound up the event is by the narrative and reveals the limitations of the courts. However, it is not merely legal limitations that Yusupova addresses, but rather the limitations of narrative itself. While many contemporary Russian poets are concerned with the self, Verdicts seems less concerned with the subjective poetic self and more concerned with the role of a documentalist, compiling stories and attempting to reveal some truth within them. Verdicts is poetry that is difficult to relate to, as the cycle is primarily related to death and murder. However, Yusupova still manages to use affect to her benefit, and by taking control of several narratives hijacked by official discourse, she transforms trauma victims into survivors. Her subjects survive through the act of mimicking traumatic experience through text, and this approach adds a new dimension to the study of trauma in poetry. Thank you.
Thank you, Scout. Okay, now we have some time for Q&A. Does anyone have any questions? The participants can ask each other, maybe the audience will ask something. Okay, so if you can think of something, please type them into the comments, and in the meantime, I'll start. So I was really struck by, let's say, parallel in several of your presentations, which had to deal with the discussions of the legacy of feminism in the Soviet space, And in Lida Yusupova, we have somebody who translates and navigates between the Western context and the East. And Olga, in your talk, you spoke about Lida Yusupova coming from Canada, having freshly done her studies in feminist theories and trying to bring them back and put them into practice on the Eastern land. But it does seem that, and Olga, you speak about it as well, that what we see in Lida is a more complex interaction between, let's say, Soviet gender politics and Western gender politics. It's not that West provides theory and East provides sex and trauma. There's more of a dialogue. And so I was wondering if you, the question is to all participants, could maybe speak about these interactions of what does Lida learn from the, let's say, Soviet women's experience, and how does it map onto her readings of Western feminism? Does it make any sense? Should I rephrase it?
I guess, yeah, I guess I'll jump in. This is really interesting and really complex, right? And it has to do with not only the West and the Soviet, but I would also argue that with the several generations of Soviet feminists or post-Soviet feminists and how the knowledge of feminism is transmitted, right? Because in theory, the idea of the library is the space that transmits knowledge over time. And yet this library is completely inaccessible to a newcomer, to somebody who wants to, find her way in, actually, but the library is a space that's inaccessible. And yet, it's interesting to think about like the presence of the named others in these poems. And of course, this is really difficult because we're going between the sort of the imaginary space of the poem and the named real people, but everyone in the poem is a real person. Everyone in a way could be read to, and obviously significant. Somebody who's named not only by her first name but by her first and last name is Masha Gessen, whose presence in this poem is quite striking. And I hadn't thought about, like, at first when I first read, like, what is Masha Gessen doing in this library? But at the time, I just recently and coincidentally came across a book that she put out from that era, and she is there to research Russian feminism, and she puts out an anthology. I have it. Sorry, I should have prepared, but it's actually, she argues in this book that this is like the first story that. The first lesbian story, the first story that she published the translation of a first story written by a Russian woman on lesbian themes. And I can't actually even find this story in Russian anywhere. Like, I mean, so the interplay is what I'm saying is the interplay between the Russian and the West. It's first of all, it's really porous. And second, in many ways, it's actually, that collaboration is actually the thing that I feel like is producing the space for learning or transmitting the knowledge between generations. That's my quick theory of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really fascinated with the subject of transmission, especially between women, right? And the way that gets activated. The imaginary genealogy, the sort of the encounters that again trigger the historical connections within these poems. Does anyone else? Anna, yeah. Anna, you're muted.
If we would think of current situation with Yulia Tsvetkova, and the Poetic Marathon, who just drew, kind of very innocent drawings of women's bodies women can have fat, women can have hair, pictures of vagina. Then you compare to what happened in the West. Georgia O'Keeffe is in every museum, right, with her drawings of vagina. Hannah Wilke, who was in Ronald Feldman Gallery, I knew her personally. I mean, she made photographs of herself with vaginas glued to her body, for years. That was the subject of her work. Hannah Wilke is also in every contemporary art museum. So now, so many years later, Yulia Tsvetkova is accused of distribution of pornography, right? And again, I think the Russian government is doing everything to marginalize and to suppress that. So I don't see how Western experience can even penetrate nowadays, because there is more and more resistance that you see from Putin's government. In other words, what kind of exchange is possible? Galina Rimbu poem, about vagina, not only was translated into many, languages. I had a Lithuanian poet friend translated into Lithuanian, among other languages. But then again, we saw backlash from Russian poets, who were just like trying to marginalize and again to say, oh, this is just nonsense, it's unimportant. And what's interesting, that women are joining that too. I published translations of Eileen Miles's couple of last poems in, Femme Letter, Femme Pismo, and there was a comment by Faina Greenberg, who actually used to be a, fairly well-respected poet, who said, oh, this is disgusting, something like that. Oh, this is horrible, So it's complicated.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Stephanie Sandler in the Q&A, if the participants would like to open and read it. Meanwhile, I'll read it out loud. To Madeline and perhaps to others. It was so striking to hear your comment that writing the phrase death of the victim over and over again gave you a visceral knowledge of what the poem was trying to convey. I wonder if we also think that for the poet herself, the same thing happened. That there is something in the way that she uses repetition, which Ilya Kukulin talked about, is also a mode of cognition. Yeah, go ahead, Madeline.
Yeah, I will try to answer this question as articulately as I can. I think it's hard to know if the same thing might have happened for the poet herself, but I think that there is something sort of paradoxical in the way that, since that phrase, there's so much unknowable in it, right? The victim herself, we don't know her name. And we also don't know the actual particulars of how she died. We just have this sort of unknowable phrase. And there's something in the repetition of that, that I'm sort of losing my train of thought a little bit, but there's something there where there absolutely is this sense of being aware of what we as readers don't know, and sort of being aware of the silence around this, being aware of the way that both the state in the form of the court and the perpetrator of this violence is sort of speaking for the victim. And so it is, yeah, being aware of all that is unsayable and unknowable makes this, at least for me as a translator, made it very sort of viscerally felt. I think it was Scout who was talking about how in some of these poems, because of the violence, because of the gruesomeness of it, it is perhaps harder to connect to the content of the poems, but I actually felt, or rather to identify with what's happening in the poems, but specifically in translating those phrases over and over, I started to identify really strongly, and I felt myself like very vulnerable, not just to those same types of violence, but this knowledge that this could have happened to anyone, that this could have happened to someone I know, right? the unknowability of the unnamed victim allows a space for us as readers to sort of imagine, like, who else might this be happening to? Who else could this happen to? And so for me as a translator and as a reader, yeah, it just made it for me really, really visceral.
Thank you, Madeline. Mark, do you have a question? Looks like you did. Oh, yeah, I thought you were.
Yes, I do, but I can see that Olga raised her hand, so
Oh.
maybe Olga will go first.
I just wanted to like echo or speak to that question too, because I feel like as a writer and as a reader of Lida Yusupova's text, I do feel like this is for those of us who did grow up in the Soviet Union, and it is a task of how to take that experience and make it useful. It is, and I do feel to your question, Stephanie, that it takes effort to break through that institutionalized language of violence that doesn't perceive itself as violence, and it's for me that's part of what that repetition is doing, for sure.
Thank you. Mark?
Well, actually, my question was for Scout, and it resonates with what just Olga said. So I like very much your idea about non-expressing, so expressing trauma through non-expressing it, right? Through using the language that actually either dismisses the trauma or replaces it with non-emotional, non-empathic discourse. But what trauma is happening here, right? Maybe so. So what I have in mind, that this language, it produces the trauma of its own, right? It produces the trauma of objectification, the trauma of dismissal, right? The trauma of sort of violence on the rhetorical plane, and on the legal plane as well, right? So is it the same trauma, or is it a different trauma? Is it the reproduction of the initial trauma, or is it sort of the new trauma that sort of follows from that initial one?
I would say is the latter. I would say that it's kind of I mean, I don't know, not reproduction, but I would say it's something new is happening
Rehearsal,
here.
right?
Yeah, something different. At least that's what I noticed, and also just the kind of comments of other people just about, you know, this sort of kind of visceral response you get from reading this poem, especially from translating it. I can definitely relate to that, and that it's, you know, it's you can't look away from it at all. And I think that the interesting thing, and Mark, I would agree with what you're saying, is that it sort of does kind of produce this new language, there's something new happening. It's not just like we're trying to actually render this traumatic event into text. It's more like you're trying to transform it. If that answers your question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it is. So basically, you're talking about some kind of multiplication of trauma as a response to trauma.
Yeah.
Or is it an exaggeration to say that?
Maybe I would have to think about it a little more to really kind of cement that argument, but perhaps.
That has a response. Go ahead.
Okay. What I wanted to say, just as a psychologist, that abused children, sexually abused children, teenagers, usually feel guilty about the abuse. And people that suffered sexual abuse for years, they deal with it with emotional detachment, depersonalization. I'm not there. It's like it's happening to me, but I'm not there. And I think this poem kind of creates a similar effect, that the effect of emotional detachment and kind of not being there and kind of observing it in such a way that creates, that is traumatic to the reader because it doesn't allow you to even be empathetic. something like that.
I certainly think there are elements of that in many of these poems. I actually would agree with that. I think what maybe just to add to it is that it's sort of that, but not at the same time. Like there's something very intimate about it, but at the same, I don't know. I found in general with Yusupova's work that it's sort of, it's one thing, it's another thing, but it kind of falls apart when you put those things together, if that makes any sense. But I would agree that there's sort of an element of detachment here.
Ambivalence and seeing it both ways.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for the wonderful presentations. We do have a video from Oksana Vasyakina that I'd like to show, but before I put it on, I just wanted to thank all of the participants and all of the attendees for spending the afternoon with us. It was very productive, I think, definitely was for me. And I'm looking forward to having you rejoin us about 3 hours from now for a reading and a discussion with Lida herself. So that will start at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I don't think there are any further comments. Okay. So thank you all so much, and I will now share the screen and play Oksana's address, which is about 10 minutes long. So it'll be just about the right amount of time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Оксана Васякина, я авторка предисловия к англоязычной книге Лиды Юсуповой. И для меня, конечно, это было большой честью, когда Энсли предложила мне его написать. Я считаю Юсупову важнейшей фигурой современной феминистской русскоязычной поэзии. Я думаю, что здесь я не объективна, а многие другие представительницы этого направления со мной согласятся. Я думаю, что Лида тоже не откажется. Что говорить обо мне, так в 2015 году, когда я впервые прочла книгу «Ритуал Сифо», я была ошеломлена. Юсупова надолго, и мне кажется, до сегодняшнего дня стала одной из ключевых фигур моих опорных фигур в письме, потому что можно сказать, что у Юсуповой я училась, и читая ее тексты, размышляя о ее методе, и метод ее, конечно, оказал на меня большое влияние, и особенно книга «Dead», ей я посвятила уже несколько своих поэтических текстов, потому что я постоянно, в некотором смысле постоянно нахожусь во внутреннем диалоге с текстами Лиды. Но сегодня мне бы хотелось поговорить о другом аспекте ее практики, и в частности о документальном письме и о той, как мне кажется, о том чуде, которое делает Юсупова. Ее я, конечно, выделяю как ключевую фигуру не только феминистского письма, но и документального. И надо признать, что сегодня документальное письмо поэтическое в России особенно является одним из самых популярных. И мне кажется, это связано с двумя аспектами. Первый связан с тем, что есть некая иллюзия, что документальный текст написать проще, с этой иллюзией я не согласна. И второй аспект связан с тем, что документальный текст, он, как правило, работает с речью других, и эти другие по закону жанра являются более уязвимыми, стигматизированными и угнетенными, и кажется, что такие тексты вызывают некий ошеломляющую реакцию человека, который читает эти тексты. И с одной стороны, они вызывают сентиментальность, с другой стороны, они сентиментальные переживания, с другой стороны, они якобы рождают такую чувственную истину. И если говорить еще, я вот сейчас, говоря, вспомнила о третьем аспекте документального письма и его популярности, мне кажется, оно связано, эта популярность связана с тем, что на документальном письме висит такой ярлык, что у этого письма есть некая миссия, да? Миссия сделать некие группы более видимыми, речь представителей меньшинств, например, более значимыми и так далее. Но все три пункта меня, конечно, я всегда ставлю под вопрос для себя, потому что мне кажется, что, работая с документальным письмом, поэт или поэтесса берут на себя очень большую ответственность, и чаще ответственность несоизмеримую с ответственностью, которую берет на себя поэт, который занимается, не знаю, лирическим высказыванием, да, от «я». И этот демократизм, который якобы дарит документальное письмо, это чистая иллюзия, потому что когда поэт работает или поэтесса работает с материалом, чужим речевым материалом, он или она, во-первых, конструирует этот текст. Да? Позиция, с которой этот человек смотрит на речевой материал, мне кажется, сравнима с позицией Бога, потому что ты ненароком сделаешь паузу там, где ее не было, для того, чтобы усилить эффект. Да? И такой подход, можно сказать, даже как сказать, как к речи других, как к конструктору, для того, чтобы вызвать некий аффект у читателей, мне кажется, очень сомнительным, этически сомнительным, с одной стороны. А с другой стороны, тут же еще вот в чем дело. Есть иллюзия, что документальная поэзия делает видимыми те группы, которые до этого молчали или там не были слышимыми. Но если учитывать то, что читателями современной поэзии является, как мне кажется, не самый большой круг русскоязычных и не русскоязычных людей, если учитывать этот факт, можем ли мы говорить вообще о некой такой функции поэзии как просветительской? Я думаю, что нет. И вот, опираясь на все это, я, конечно, ставлю большой этический вопрос над новой модой документального письма и новой моды на документальное письмо, но здесь, конечно же, из вот этого объема всего, мне кажется, фигура Юсуповой выделяется, в хорошем смысле выделяется, потому что Юсупова не забирает речь других. Она не занимается приватизацией речи секс-работниц. Она не занимается приватизацией речи онкобольных или людей, содержащихся в психоневрологических диспансерах. Она приватизирует речь другого. И этим другим является речь судопроизводства. И в этом смысле, конечно, такой это радикальный поворот, да, не забирать речь у угнетенных, а для того, чтобы показать некое реальное, а наоборот, забрать речь у угнетателя для того, чтобы это реальное достать из этой речи. Что она делает в своих приговорах? Она, как с позиции Бога, да, уже в обратную сторону идет эта работа, с позиции автора, с авторки кроит речь, кроит текст приговора для того, чтобы проявить реальное. И таким образом, мне кажется, что направление в сторону иерархий, оно имеет эмансипаторный заряд, в отличие от направления работы в сторону угнетенных. И, конечно, мне кажется, что Юсупова в этом смысле важнейшая фигура документального письма, потому что она производит эту процедуру отъема речи. И поэтому, собственно, она имеет влияние. И поэтому, например, если говорить уже не о эстетическом поле, а, например, говорить о правозащите, которая сегодня с поэзией, как ни странно, сопряжены достаточно близко, и так мы сегодня в России живем, поэзия, политизированная на уровне, конечно, риторики, поэзия, она всегда находится в одном шаге от правозащиты и активизма. И если говорить о том, как, например, Юсупова влияет на мир, и уже смотреть на поэзию как на некий, как на агента, да, в изменении мира, то я сразу вспоминаю проект, который буквально недавно появился. Его сделали НКО, занимающиеся женской правозащитой, в частности, называется консорциум женских правовых инициатив. Они занимаются женщинами, пострадавшими от домашнего насилия, занимаются женщинами, которые сидят в тюрьме, и, как правило, сидят в тюрьме за то, что убили мужчин, которые долгое время избивали их, убили мужчин, защищая свои жизни. И консорциум вместе с Хакатоном, это такой тоже большой достаточно проект, который посвящен всяким инновациям в поле Big Data, сделали проект, который называется «Близким лицом близкому лицу», названный в честь строчки одной из поэм Лиды Юсуповой. И этот проект «Близким лицом близкому лицу», собственно, появился, потому что Саша Граф, как раз занимающаяся этим проектом, прочитала стихи Лиды Юсуповой и поняла, что официальная статистика не соответствует реальности. И поэтому они научили машину, нейросеть, научили выявлять дела об убийствах женщин, в которых убийство женщин было произведено в процессе, я сама говорю уже как судья, дела об убийствах женщин, убийства в которых были совершены в процессе домашнего насилия. И таким образом, проведя этот первый эксперимент и обработав пробное количество приговоров, проект «Близким лицом близкому лицу» вывел, что официальная статистика ошибается в 2 или в 3 раза. И оказалось, что дел о домашнем насилии сегодня в России рассматривается намного больше, чем гласит официальная статистика. И это то, что делают активистки, и то, что делают НКО, они выявляют реальное. И то же самое делает Юсупова, отбирая также те же приговоры, которые отбирают НКО у государства, и Юсупова, которая также отбирает у государства тексты и переделывая, перекраивая их для того, чтобы выявить реальное, и здесь они встречаются. Я вижу, по времени сильно затянула, и я надеюсь, что речь не была такой сумбурной, и пока я говорила, у меня садится солнце. Не могу сказать, что я была рада всех видеть, потому что я никого не увижу. Вы видите просто видео, которое я для вас записываю. Я ужасно рада, что мне удалось записать это видео и рассказать то, что меня волнует. И я надеюсь, что англоязычные читательницы и читатели оценят тексты Юсуповой, и профессиональное сообщество оценит ее вклад в историю поэзии вообще. Вот. Спасибо вам большое за то, что вы послушали мое обращение. Всем хорошего дня.
Well, thank you, Oksana. Virtually, I think that was a really perfect conclusion to our today's panel, since Oksana's speech really tied up many of the subjects that we were raising. In particular, there was a lot of resonance with Stephanie Sandler's talk about the exposure of the real and the place of the language of the symbolic authority in indeed this exercises. Okay, so with that, I will conclude our panels. Thank you all so much, and I will see each other in less than 3 hours for Lida's live reading. Thank you.
Thank you.